Okay, welcome everybody. It's great to see everyone back. I think this is appropriate to say, and now for something completely different. Has anyone seen the menu for tonight? Okay, so you'll see that it's a tad different than what we've been experiencing in the last few weeks, and there is a reason for that, right? Before I begin with a little bit of framing and connection, as we do every course, I wanted to introduce our speakers, who are going to be really, really interesting on a whole other level. The first is Gabriel Rosenberg. He's a visiting assistant professor in the Department of History at Duke. He got his BA from Grinnell in 2003 and his PhD from Brown in 2011. And he's interested in the development of the modern American state and its interaction with rural culture and society in the first half of the 20th century. His other major research interests include histories of sexuality and gender, the history of childhood and youth, theories and comparative histories of the state, environmental history, and the history of international development. And he is currently preparing a monograph, which is completely relevant to our course, called Breeding the Future, 4H and the Roots of the Modern Rural World, which is a really interesting form of intellectual history. And as he writes, Breeding the Future explores the history of the iconic rural youth organization from its origins in U.S. rural social reform and state-building efforts to its current role in global development. So very interesting topic, not something that one would think about doing a history of until we have a wonderful new scholar deciding that we really need to know this. So, Gabe, it's wonderful to have you here. And we also have in response Professor Chantal Reid, who her experience spans from biochemical to ecosystem levels in natural and managed vegetation. And she has worked on a number of different areas of plant biology and engineering. She has looked at plant-insect interactions while at McGill University in biology. She studied physiological aspects of ecosystem productivity. And she has looked at whole plant carbon balancing in forest seedlings for her PhD in botany at Duke University. She is really interested in global change research and particularly looking at air pollutants as ozone and potentially invasive species and how we track those and think about those. And she has a very wonderful course going on right now in sustainability and agriculture. And she also teaches a freshman seminar on food and food systems, which apparently is a very popular seminar. So please join me in welcoming Chantal. So the last 2 weeks we have explored the questions of agrarianism, land ownership, and the intellectual history in America behind the idea of the farm and the idea of nature and the idea of land, and the implications that has for our legal system and our practices around ecology and farming. Professors Wurzba, Holland, Purdy, and Nowlin have given us a sense of the intellectual legacy in America that has led us to our current food practices, but even more specifically also the origins of the local food movement. We're now moving even more closely into the American history of food, particularly the industrial ideal in American agriculture, and what was hoped for in the development of our contemporary food system. And I want to make sure, even as we are searingly critical and trying to figure out a way forward, we also remember, and I think Gabe's going to share some of this with us, of what the hope was in the contemporary food system. And whenever you get excited about a solution, just imagine your descendants 100 years from now thinking about how silly you are in whatever way you are. And that's kind of the way we might think about what was hoped for with sympathy in the early 20th century. And I think it's very important that I explain, and both Kathy and Charlie have mentioned this as we were talking about today's class, why we are having a 1920s meal, which is what we're having. This is the moment, as Kathy Rudy explains, when federal, state, and local governments and corporations get more heavily involved in food production. the reason that this kind of food production that involved the federal, state, and local governments and corporations, why it was so easily adopted across the country is that it offered new and exciting tastes, many of which we will be experiencing. And they may not be so new and exciting, but what we are asking you to do is imagine them as new and exciting today. The railroad also helps with the delivery of food and food items, and most folks across the country transition out of the majority of local into national food economies. So we're moving from local to national food economies at the beginning of the 20th century. As Gabe Rosenberg will explain, though, it also brings food and farming and families into the space where they are defined by corporate and government officials who decide what normal is. Right? So that's part of the interaction that we're seeing emerging in the early 20th century. And this is crucial for everybody to think about, this period of history. It's crucial for those of you who are engineers in thinking about how these food systems got produced, these transportation, civil engineering projects took off. It's crucial for business because we are now going to begin to examine the necessity of industry, the role of the corporation, the idea of the farm as industrial. It's crucial for law, for all the reasons we've been talking about before, but also what kinds of corporate tax and transportation laws made the transportation of food and the idea of industry as a model possible. It's important for social scientific worldviews. How do we think about the food and family in different ways, and even the family farm as an industrial entity? What does that do to social networks? Scientific discourse, which I know Chantal will be also addressing. What is made scientifically possible in the growth of industrial food and the growth of the industrial model? And humanistic questions about what a good society looks like and what a good family is. So all of you, with your various kinds of training, even also in public policy, in terms of transportation policy, in terms of ideas of what the public is now with the railroad shifting foodstuffs back and forth across state lines, all of you have something very important to bring to this new historical conversation. We thought we would begin this conversation with a Chipotle ad, which many of you may have seen, in the recent large event that happened last week. So.
Just guessing at numbers and figures, pulling the puzzles apart. Questions of science, science and progress don't speak as loud as my heart. Nobody said it was easy. It's such a shame for us to part. Nobody said it was easy. No one ever said it would be so hard. I'm going back to the start.
had a bit of an email conversation around this ad, which I hope you discuss in your small groups after Gabe's lecture. We wanted to share with you some of our comments from Charlie and Kathy to get you thinking about it, as well as conversing about it later on during the meal. The first is the dream of a small family farm might just be that, a dream. Industry and government have been involved in agriculture all along, at least since 1880. So the idea of what the Chipotle farmer is returning to is an interesting question. Heather's question, where's Heather? She's somewhere. There she is. Heather posted some great, oh, there. Which Heather? That was, yeah, that was Heather. Yeah. She said it seems like a good question for discussion. When the issues of values associated with small local farming become hot marketing tools and are then used to serve business concerns, and Chipotle stock is up, many people on our discussion list remarked upon the fact that Chipotle stock was up after this ad, rather markedly. Is it a good thing, raising awareness, changing the vocabulary and philosophical landscape in public discourse on food and farming, or does the marketing and corporate response mean that the changes mostly stay in the discursive realm? It's a really interesting question, and I hope we have really vigorous debate about that. Right? So what if corporations actually do change? How do we think about that as a possibility? What if they, or is it the nature of a corporation only to subsume for its own interests and not to change? It's a really interesting question. And Charlie also added to this in conversation with his food activist wife, Hope Shand, the following questions. I don't know how many of you know this, but maybe every one of you knows this, that Chipotle was owned by McDonald's, but it is not now owned by McDonald's. They have some progressive worker policies, or they did at some point. The company does serve naturally raised pork and naturally raised beef, but Hope, and my guess is Charlie, is not exactly sure what that means. And Hope asks, what's the big deal about a vegetarian diet for pigs? Isn't that corn and other grains? If we're still eating a pork and beef diet, what does that mean for climate change? And what about all the labor questions inside the restaurant and farm worker treatment for tomatoes and lettuce and so on? What do we think about a company having and marketing nostalgia about farming? What do we think about the racial identity of the people in the film? Where are the workers in the pork factory in the middle of the piece? The machines in this ad are doing all the work. What do we think of that? Who owns the land where the hogs are in the end of the film? And can the farm family depicted really make a living off of a few head of livestock, which are shown in the film? And how much would that meat sell for by the pound? So, and we all agreed that the only reason why we would show this ad is to unpack it with questions like these. So as a form of framing and as a way of getting us back with the industrial, we thought we'd end the framing with that ad and turn it over to Gabe.
Thank you for that kind introduction. I'd like to start by saying that it's a great pleasure to be part of the dynamic and important conversation that this class is cultivating. And I'm particularly grateful to Dean Patton, Professor Rudy, and Professor Thompson for inviting me to speak and for all their important labors for this course. I'd also like to thank the people who designed and executed the menu for the post-lecture meal. I can't imagine a greater way to honor someone who studies the history of food, farming, and health in early 20th century America than through this very unique act of historical recreation about which I am very excited. I was tickled when I first saw it, and I'm going to be even more delighted to see how it comes off on the actual plate. So I'd like to start us with two clips, and I would preface this by saying I had actually considered using the Chipotle clip in the place of the first clip, but I'm going to stick with the original plan at this point. And the first comes to us from the public intellectual, food sovereignty activist, and outspoken critic of commercial agribusiness, Raj Patel. In this clip, Patel is speaking with Amy Goodman on her populist leftist radio show, Democracy Now! And let's hear what he has to say.
The issue of farm subsidies and how they support agribusiness?
Well, I mean, if one looks at the Farm Bill, I mean, it's, again, an historic compromise between urban and rural politicians in the United States. The largest slice of the Farm Bill is actually dedicated towards food assistance programs. But within the commodity programs, the sort of 40% of the Farm Bill, more or less, that is dedicated to crop support, a large slice of that does go to the richest sort of 10% of farmers. Now, this isn't to say that we don't need farm subsidies. I mean, small farmers and sustainable family farms in the United States absolutely need investment and need support. But the way that the Farm Bill and the way that our United States Department of Agriculture works at the moment is really a handmaiden to these large agricultural concerns and mega farms, rather than the sustainable family farms that are going to produce the healthy fruits and vegetables that we so desperately need in our to feed the 50 million Americans who are food insecure.
Now, for the sake of balance, let's listen to what the most notorious of those agribusinesses that he mentions, namely Monsanto, America's premier seed and biotechnology firm, has to say on the matter. And this clip, part of a broader advertising campaign known as America's Farmers, plays regularly on television stations across America and seems as much designed to speak to the average American voter as it does to Monsanto's customer base of farmers.
Your food, your clothes, even your fuel, it comes from right here.
We take great care to grow quality products. We're consumers just like you.
Who grows our quality of life? We do.
We're the people who grow your crops.
We're America's farm families.
Brought to you on behalf of America's farmers by Monsanto.
Right, so the commercial places rhetorical and visual emphasis on family, and of course elsewhere the campaign explicitly celebrates the family farm as a target of adulation and celebration. Now, we can assume that Monsanto and Raj Patel disagree on quite a bit. The status of genetically modified organisms, the structure of agricultural subsidies, environmental regulation, to name just a few. Monsanto is not only America's premier seed tech firm, Monsanto also spends millions of dollars on lobbying for agricultural regulations that reinforce mass-scale capital-intensive production. And Patel, of course, is industrial agriculture's outspoken critic. What's really curious, then, is not those disagreements, which are in some ways quite predictable, but what Patel and Monsanto agree on. It is an agreement that I argue reflects a much broader cultural consensus about farming, about families, and about health in modern America. Patel and Monsanto are in accord about the importance of something called the family farm. Defined in the abstract, a family farm is a farm that is owned and operated by a single family, often for generations on the same plot of land. In its idealized form, the family farm is composed of a farmer father, a farm wife mother, and children who help out and work through chores. In broad strokes, the idea of the family farm transposes the familiar suburban nuclear family unit onto the countryside and then cements it the essential rural economic activity, namely farming. In practice, this definition covers an extraordinary variety of farms. Farms mammoth and tiny, organic and conventional, niche, artisanal, and cash cropping, growing food for the Watts Grocery and growing food for Archer Daniels Midland. Hence Patel's addition of the caveat sustainable, though I would contend that that term also lacks real semantic precision. So despite this definitional slipperiness, the term family farm seems to hold amazing resonance in American food discourse. It appears regularly in popular discussions of food and agriculture which envision healthy living in the countryside, of course without the specifics of policy. But you might also hear it mentioned explicitly in a host of actual policy debates about American agricultural and food policy. The family farm is invoked by both right and left in a wide variety of policy contexts, including agricultural subsidies, environmental and consumer protections, and tax policies, namely around debates about the estate tax. In all of these cases, both popular and elite, the family farm is a model of everything that is deemed worthy, positive, and esteemed about rural America. It stands in for farming that is more permanent, virtuous, wholesome, and healthy. My talk challenges us to take neither land, nor farms, nor families as natural givens, but as contingent historical, social, and cultural products. As a historian, my goal today is to get us to think a bit more critically about how a concept like the family farm isn't a permanent feature of American experience, but in fact is the product of a variety of broad historical processes. In that, I'd like to get us to start thinking about some of the historical relationships between farming on the one hand and reproduction on the other. And to do that, my talk today is structured around a few points, which I'll offer as a series of questions. First, I'd like to unpack some of the explicit and implicit meanings of the term family farm in contemporary American culture. And second, I'll show how the term family farm evolved from a bit of sociological jargon to a popular ideal. Third, I'll compare that evolving and dynamic meaning to the equally dynamic relationship between land, families, and health in American history. And finally, I'll step back and try to explain how all of this relates to this class and contemporary discussions of food politics. We need, however, to begin by asking exactly what sorts of meanings are assigned to this term family farm. And I would note that this meaning is inflected by a number of agrarian assumptions that you may already be familiar with through your course readings from individuals like Wendell Berry. And I contend that there are at least three interrelated assumptions embedded in our celebrations of the family farm. First, a family farm suggests a personal or human scale of operation. It assures customers that real people composed of real flesh, bone, and blood are touching the soil, harvesting the crop, and growing the food. These people are real, and they form real, lasting connections to the land, and those connections make those people more moral. So more importantly, we also imagine unique virtue and responsibility in families in particular that may be lacking in other units of economic action like corporations or state agencies. Families must have consciences, we reason, because families are people, not faceless, inhuman abstractions. Families are in fact held to be the very places where morality, ethics, and virtue are taught, places resistant to the corrupting influences of public life and public culture. Families are supposedly the holdfasts of virtue and responsibility. This sense of virtue is tied to the second facet. A family farm is a farm that reproduces. Families, we reason, are our units of social reproduction, how society organizes the work of reproducing itself. And similarly, a family farm is one that will be passed through the generations, from parent to child, through the decades and through the centuries. That continuity, in turn, seems to impose on the current farmer concerns about the future. A rotten future for the land is a rotten future for the farm and for the farmer's children and grandchildren, and thus the logic reasons the farmer will work to assure the sustainability and permanence of the farm, motivated by loyalty and care for his family. We have proof of this reproductivity in the third conceptual feature. It is popularly understood to be the traditional way in which American agriculture has been organized. And this logic contends that stretching back to time immemorial, or at least since Anglo-American settlers have been on the North American continent, Americans planted their roots in the soil through family farms, and thus we believe that family farms represent continuous relationships to the land stretching back generations and centuries. It is only in the late 20th century, since perhaps the 1970s, if Michael Pollan's Omnivore's Dilemma is to be believed, that those family farms have been pushed to the side by industrial agriculture, forced to monocrop corn and soy, and thus to sever the deep and permanent ties that rooted fecund rural families in the land over so very many generations. In contrast to this narrative, a narrative that tells us that the family farm is an expression of a deeply rooted agrarian ideal and lifestyle, my argument today is that the family farm, as we understand it, represents a very powerful and recent invented tradition. I mean, first invented in the sense that the term is the product of a set of inventors, government officials, rural-focused academics, and the farm press of the 1930s. But second, I also mean invent in the sense that something new replaces its precedents. And specifically, agrarian rhetoric frequently papers over a history of farming that was hardly a vision of a bucolic pre-capitalist Eden. Rather than embodying permanent, nurturing, multi-generational relationships to the land and to each other, pre-industrial American agriculture was often transient, impermanent, and environmentally and socially extractive. Farmers throughout American history have been at the vanguard of a massive colonial project, the settlement and exploitation of the North American continent, its peoples, and its resources, and they have also been among the first victims of that project. experiencing dislocation, exploitation, and intense human suffering. That suffering, not landed virtue, was the permanent, multi-generational legacy of American agriculture. And I'll try to unpack all of this in due course. But first, I'd like to examine the history of the term family farm itself, and I think that this will be highly illustrative of the broader argument. So is anyone familiar with Google Ngrams? Does anyone know what a Google Ngram is? Raise your hand if you do. Well, I'll explain it. For those of you who are not, Google has developed a web application that allows you to track the frequency of the use of a term in its entire digital database. So it generates a graph, and on the x-axis we will have the year of publication, and on the y-axis we have the percentage of books in Google's digital library, the largest library in the world at this point, in which the search term appears. So keep in mind that Google has digitized millions of books and publications at this point, and the result is a rough and dirty, imperfect snapshot of the cultural popularity of a given term as it's reflected in published documents. This is the Google Ngram for the term family farm from 1880 to 2000. You will quickly notice that family farm appears in almost no publications prior to 1900. And this is true if you extend the search back to the 18th or 17th centuries. It is used infrequently between 1900 and 1930, and then it gains in sudden popularity very rapidly in the mid-1930s, finally peaking in use in the late 1980s at the tail end of the so-called farm crisis of that decade. And from this alone, we can gauge that the term carried very little cultural cachet prior to the 1930s. And in fact, people didn't use it or find it particularly meaningful very often. But in fact, it is not only the frequency of the term that changes, the underlying meaning of the phrase changes dramatically over the same time period. And I'm going to argue that we can look at this in terms of three periods of meaning. The first period, prior to 1900, the term family farm means narrowly a landed hereditary estate. And this meaning is borrowed from the tradition of British nobility, in which the source of wealth for the aristocracy was in large landed estates passed through the male line. In the American context, that estate may, in fact, have been a functioning farm, but it was not required. And on those large estates, its owners seldom operated the farm, but usually hired a farm manager to tend it while they were absent. It might also merely be a rural manor held by a wealthy family that did not feature an operational farm, or in 20th century terms, or 21st century terms rather, a vacation home. And many references to a family farm, in fact, refer to a wealthy businessman, merchant, politician, or lawyer retiring to the family farm, or in other words, abandoning their urban profession to return to a landed estate that had been managed by others in their absence. The New York Tribune used it in this sense when they wrote in 1872 that Corsica was, quote, a sort of family farm to the Bonapartes. And ostensibly, the Tribune did not mean that Louis Napoleon and Napoleon Eugene Bonaparte tilled the Corsican soil while Eugenia de Montijo tended the hearth. Rather, the family farm here meant an inherited source of wealth in the form of real property that the Bonapartes could pass from generation to generation. The second phase of meaning exists between 1900 and 1930. And in the first decade of the 20th century, the new disciplines of rural sociology and agricultural economics begin to use the phrase single-family farm or family-sized farm as sociological descriptors for farms that were small enough that a single family could operate them with only occasionally employing outside labor. Rural sociologists use this term to describe farms in the Near West, those lands open to settlement primarily after the Civil War through the Homestead Act of 1862. And so Theodore Roosevelt, writing with his characteristic bombast, wrote that such homestead farms embodied, quote, the family farm, the most important and most American of all our institutions, though his comments suggested that this institution in turn only existed because of very recent federal policies in the West, namely the Homestead Act and a set of other policies in the late 19th century. Finally, beginning in the early 1930s and continuing to the present, family farm took on its contemporary celebratory meaning as the basic and essential unit of farm life, a unit of economic production and social reproduction, composed of a nuclear family with labor carefully delimited by gender. And those meanings in turn leapt from the dusty pages of academics and found their way into much broader discourse, appearing regularly in the popular press, in films, and in television shows. And by 1951, the Secretary of Agriculture, Charles Brennan, would announce that national policy should be tailored to help, quote, the family farm because in the family, members' attitudes of self-reliance, social responsibility, individual initiative, tolerance, and self-government were paramount. Federal policy guaranteed that only some families received such plaudits. It was, by 1951, not only a largely invented tradition, but a tradition that excluded anyone who did not conform to its vision of white, middle-class heteronormativity. I'm going to save my explanation of the whys and hows of that drift from sociological jargon to an invented tradition in a moment, so file away this moment. File it away, we'll be coming back to it. But first, we need to understand the significance of this changing meaning and the complex systems of kinship and intimacy that came before the family farm. And in order to do that, we need to know a little bit more about agriculture in the 19th century. To understand 19th century American farms and rural people, you must understand the fundamental dynamic that structured agricultural markets across the tremendously diverse regions of the United States. With few exceptions, farms in the 19th century existed in the same economic environment. Land was cheap and labor was expensive. This seemingly simple observation had profound consequences for American farmers and how they related to their land. Farmers, whether rich or poor, large or small, recognized that productivity of their land depended on the health of the soil that they farmed. They also recognized that the continuous farming of a single plot of land would eventually wear out the soil. In modern day, we know that this was because it depletes nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus, and other nutrients and minerals. This process was quite predictable and empirically visible to any farmer, even if they didn't know anything about soil chemistry. Farms on virgin soil would record abundant yields in their initial years, but the subsequent years rarely matched their bumper crops, and after a decade, those yields experienced an irreversible steady decline. In the absence of cheap synthetic fertilizers, the solution to this problem for many farmers was simply to up and move west, seeking out land that had not yet been cultivated and was still inexpensive, thanks in no small part to the socialization of security and transportation costs through federally financed infrastructure and military projects. And the frontier, as this strip of virgin land became known, moved from the Appalachians at the end of the 18th century to the Ohio River Valley and inland south in the early national period to the Mississippi River Valley, Texas, and the near west by the mid-19th century. In each of these migratory waves, new settlers came primarily not from abroad or towns or cities. Rather, they often came from farms further east where the soil had actually already been exhausted. And they came to uproot indigenous ecologies and societies, to put up fences and grow row crops as they had done out east, making permanent and irreversible the land's transition into market capitalism. Thus, settlers fueling the corn whiskey boom of the early national period came to Ohio, Kentucky, and Indiana from corn farms in Maryland, eastern Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and New York, where yields had diminished so severely that bare subsistence was the best that could be accomplished in many cases. Agricultural bulletins in the early 19th century recorded a desolate rural landscape stretching the entirety of the eastern seaboard, abandoned rural homes left to deteriorate, exhausted soil, once fecund fields, now fallow, and windswept and badly eroded land. With each wave, those who stayed behind to form the now lauded, lasting relationships with the land were those least likely to be engaged in actual agricultural labor. Those who could afford to hire or enslave the hands necessary to spread the manure were also the ones whose time was better spent in the genteel and esoteric study of the science, art, and philosophy of husbandry, pursuits often inspired by their gentleman farmer model, Thomas Jefferson. Mobility, impermanence, contingency, and rigid private hierarchies thus characterized American farms in the 19th century, and it was exactly these characteristics that could also be used to describe the families that lived on those farms. To begin with, expensive labor, as I've already mentioned, gave incentive for families to make use of whatever labor they could. Thus, families of the 19th century were large, multi-generational, and highly fluid. Rather than the nuclear family of the mid-20th century we now associate with rural living, 19th century farms might house as many as 3 or 4 generations, with multiple couples living under the same roof or in the same room. Similarly, not all members of the family needed to be direct blood relatives. So complex marital patterns and demand for labor meant that functional kinship between functional kinship relationships emerged between sprawling families fused by a single marriage. Hired hands might become uncles, and entirely unrelated neighbors might become kin simply because they helped out when help was needed. In the South, slaveholders indulged the pretense that slaves were their children. And in fact, because sex between slaves and slaveholders, both consensual and non-consensual, was common enough in the antebellum South, the enslaved often were the actual children of their owners. The resulting complex kinship ties were always far in excess of what the formal institution of marriage could accommodate. There was, in this sense, no single model of families, intimacy, or kinship in 19th century America. People sought out and found intimacy far beyond the boundaries of companionate marriage and far beyond the companionate family with which we are now so familiar. Labor scarcity meant that on most farms, everyone worked, with high labor flexibility being the watchword. For northern families growing corn or wheat, there were abstract gendered norms that associated women with labor done near the physical dwelling and men with labor done in the field. But during periods of peak labor demand, or when men were absent or sick, these divisions broke down and women labored in the fields. Regardless, women took primary responsibility for vegetable, fruit, dairying, and egg production, all activities that resulted in products that they sold to generate revenue necessary for the daily upkeep of the farm. And by contrast, male-gendered labor in the field resulted in a once-per-season influx of revenue, namely at harvest. In the South, these sorts of gendered divisions broke down altogether. Black rural women worked regularly in tobacco and cotton fields, and the same went for poor white women. Similarly, children of all ages worked. A 1910 study found that a stunning 1.4 million children between the ages of 10 and 15 claimed full-time employment on American farms, or in other words, in 1910, 72% of all child laborers worked on farms, not in urban industrial factories. But grueling labor for all exacted a terrible toll. Large families meant that rural women were often pregnant, and demand for their labor ensured that they worked late into the pregnancy and returned to work almost immediately after birth. The result was high maternal and infant mortality rates in rural areas. It's at precisely this point in American history that connections between families, health, and farming begin to cohere around the concept of the family farm in expert sociological and agricultural discourse. This rural world of poverty, impermanence, illness, and dislocation inspired those experts to try to reorganize the chaotic American countryside into a managed, rational, and to their mind, scientific landscape. Their targets in this effort were both the family and the farm, and their programs tended to address both together. For farms and families both, they promoted the values of the industrial ideal, among them efficiency, standardization, specialization, and quantification, all of which in turn helped to move farms from labor-intensive models of production to capital-intensive models instead. And the reading from Deborah Fitzgerald describes how those values were applied to farm operations, but we should think a bit more broadly about how the same values could be applied to the family as well, and in fact used to celebrate in particular those familial relationships that were in turn landed explicitly. The article from Laura Lovett describes the Better Baby contests of the early 20th century, and those contests offer but one entree into this process. Borrowing from the logic of animal husbandry and the burgeoning human eugenics movement, agricultural progressives publicly announced that the health and attractiveness of rural infants could be evaluated according to an objective, quantifiable standard, and they organized contests in rural public spaces for precisely that purpose. To be clear, Better Baby contests were partially motivated by abysmal health in rural areas, and particularly high infant mortality rates. So in this sense, they were connected to a very real rural health crisis, one that we would do well not to forget. But they were also connected to a broader eugenic aesthetic, the concept that there was a racially and gender-specific norm of fitness against which all human bodies could be compared. In addition, that medical and government officials could assess that fitness and work to control human reproduction accordingly. This belief, in turn, justified an expanded role for the government in determining what a normal family was, and furthermore, how the government might reproduce normal families by regulating forms of desire and intimacy. And thus, to understand what normalcy means within this particular historical context, we need to think about normalcy of both farms and families, and about intimacy as well. So let me illustrate what I mean here with an example that comes from my own major research project. And many of you will be familiar with 4-H, the iconic rural youth organization. What you may not know is that 4-H is a product of the broader rural modernization movement that I've just described, and is in fact administered by the United States Department of Agriculture. The number in the corner here, 18 USC 707, actually records the portion of the federal code that gives full ownership of the 4-H name and emblem to the USDA and makes its unauthorized use a federal crime punishable by a prison term. So be careful how you use your 4-H emblem. The USDA assumed control of 4-H clubs in 1914 with the creation of the Cooperative Extension Service, a rural modernization program that placed at least one agent in every county across the nation. And those county agents were intended to give expert advice to regular farmers and also advice about home economics. 4-H was the youth-oriented portion of this program, and county agents spent about a third of their time on 4-H with the hope that they could bypass resistant adults and make youth the actual agents of modern agricultural and homemaking reform. By the 1920s, 4-H clubs were also tied into the broader eugenic health programs I've already described. So beginning in 1922, a national 4-H health competition was held at the International Livestock Exposition in Chicago, and articles about the winners of those contests would then circulate widely in the popular press to advertise the embodied benefits of cooperating with the Extension Service and the USDA. So this, for example, appears in the Chicago Tribune. Oh, I'm sorry. Publicity for the 1930 Illinois 4-H health 4-H health champions in the Chicago Tribune, and they are the Illinois health champions. Pristine youth, clearly. We should be so lucky to be so healthy. Here's how an article in the Washington Post described the 1925 National 4-H Health Competition. Alongside grand champion steers, prized porkers, sheared sheep, high-stepping horses were the healthiest boy and girl in the United States, selected in very much the same manner. Expert judges looked them over, poked them, punched them, and put them through their paces. Male champion Co Emmons' eyes, ears, nose, and throat are perfect, netting him a total of 14 points. His head is perfect too, as are his hair, his scalp, his face, neck, chest, back, abdomen, arms, hands, legs, feet, posture, gait, muscles, and nerves. His clean, lean body netted him 2 more points, and the perfection of his measurements netted him 7. He's symmetrical, we can assume from this as well. Right? From this connection of healthy youth and livestock, we can see that Fitzgerald's industrial ideal, with its celebration of objective standards and quantifiable metrics, was inseparable from Lovett's eugenic aesthetic that prized and promoted the fit, white bodies of the rural middle class. Both were part of a much broader modernist discourse that dreamed of bringing order, permanence, and healthy reproduction to the ever so disorderly farms and bodies that populated the American countryside. It is at almost precisely this moment that the term family farm moves from academic to popular and political discourse. In the early 1930s, the plummeting national birth rate, the rural ecological catastrophe of the Dust Bowl, and the broader human catastrophe of the Great Depression spurred the Roosevelt administration to intervene in unprecedented ways in the management of rural America. The passage of the Agricultural Adjustment Act of 1933 created agricultural production subsidies, which still live on today in our farm bills, and later New Deal programs created a national system of agricultural credit. Other New Deal programs created rural environmental planning, electrification, and infrastructure programs. Together, these programs accomplished 3 broad things. First, New Deal programs gave the federal government a permanent presence in the American countryside as a planner and subsidizer of agriculture and rural life. And I say planner and subsidizer both. They're always involved in subsidization of particular lifestyles in the American countryside. Second, New Deal programs codified Fitzgerald's industrial ideal as national agricultural policy. New Deal subsidy programs were, at the end of the day, production subsidies, and they were structured to give farmers incentives to maximize production through mechanization, expansion, and crop specialization within the acreage that they actually did farm. Indeed, New Deal programs also provided the financial and physical infrastructures to abet and promote that process. Third of all of these programs took as their fundamental justification saving the family farm, in explicitly those terms. Indeed, New Deal political rhetoric grabbed the family farm from the dusty pages of rural sociology and agricultural economics journals and redistributed it in government planning documents, press releases, and public speeches as a raison d'etre of agricultural policy. To be certain, these policies had a very narrow definition of what counted as a family farm. The structure and wording of the policies assured that white landed farmers benefited overwhelmingly from New Deal programs, and public celebrations of those family farms meant that narrowly white heteronormative farms in which everyone played their appropriate gender role. This development is in fact evident in 4-H as well. And by the 1930s, 4-H had around 1 million members, making it the largest youth organization in the country. If in the 1920s, 4-H offered the USDA a way to promote its eugenically inflected vision of embodied health, during the New Deal, the same officials now scheme to pair fit rural youth and have them create new family farms of their own. In fact, educational experts and USDA officials lauded 4-H as an excellent way to socialize healthy heterosexuality in the countryside, or socialize heterosexuality as they would describe it. Club leaders could teach youth about how to be desirable to the opposite sex, how to manage their desires, and about social hygiene and the biology of human sexual reproduction. Then fit, well, nice accompaniment to my nice. Then fit rural boys and girls could meet in the wholesome spaces provided by 4-H meetings, gatherings, picnics, and dances. There it was understood they would romance each other under the watchful eye of the county agent or volunteer club leader, ensuring that teen lust did not give way to immoral behavior. Rather, youth would be steered through the 4-H program into creating their own family farms, with boys becoming farmers and girls becoming nurturing farmers' wives, in explicitly those terms. This ideal of 4-H romance found popular expression in the 1942 film put out by Fox, Young America, wherein a decadent rich girl from the city, played by teen starlet Jane Withers, moves to the countryside where she joins a 4-H club and falls in love with a hunky farm boy played by Robert Cornell. You can see Robert here has a great 4-H tie, which I wish I had. This is Jane Withers here on the left. She is a little bit irritated that at the moment he seems to be giving his affection elsewhere. Don't worry, by the end, they come together. Robert Cornell at the time was actually 30, and Jane Withers was 16, so how healthy that is, I will leave to your judgment. But this rural romance transformed Jane's character from a bratty, superficial city girl and into a woman ready to settle down to her real business, namely that of creating a family with Robert Cornell. Similarly, a 1937 article in the Rotarian summarized their consensus view of 4-H when it hailed 4-H leaders as, quote, a combined sage, confessor, counselor, and friend who could offer wise advice not only on club work, but also how to act when out on a date, or when was the best age to get married. So what is most fascinating to me, and perhaps unsettling to you about these portrayals, is that they accord such significance to a government program in helping boys and girls come together to create family farms. That in some sense, if we understand the family farm to be the ideal expression of rural heterosexual desire, these portrayals seem to suggest that heterosexual desire will emerge warped and lacking if it does not have that sage counsel and advice offered by 4-H and the USDA more broadly. This in turn brings into sharp relief just how very constructed both the notion of the family farm and its related celebration of white-landed rural normalcy truly were. In other words, they're not pre-existing, free-floating ideals. They exist in relationship to actual arrangements of power and capital. So we've had a somewhat complicated and hopefully not too dull history up to this point, and I want to end now by zooming out and talking about what all of this means for students interested in studying and perhaps changing the American food system. First, this history suggests that the family farm emerged not in opposition to the processes of agricultural mechanization and industrialization, but as a vital piece of it. My point is that the family farm, as a standardized model of rural normalcy, is the extension of the industrial ideal to human family life, and was intended to serve as a rational, standard, and permanent alternative to the chaos and impermanence of rural family life that preceded it. And specifically that had preceded the advent of capital-intensive mass-scale agriculture. Like industrial agriculture more broadly, this model came with both costs and benefits for rural people. It stigmatized the exploitative laboring of women and children, it carved out new spaces for female authority in rural life, and it helped to alleviate the very real health problems that existed in rural America at the time. But it also created an exclusionary ideal that in turn marked some families and bodies as unfit, made gendered and sexual norms more rigid, and generally radically narrowed the scope of acceptable familial relationships in rural America. And regardless of whether it was better or worse than what came before, it offered no refuge from the process of industrialization, and doesn't now offer us an essential alternative to industrial agriculture. There is no categorical opposition between industrial and family farming. As a celebration of landed white rural families, the family farm also celebrates access to capital, private property ownership, and public policies that will reward precisely those characteristics. It is thus inextricable from the broader economic and political institutions that incentivize capital-intensive mass-scale agribusiness. And in this sense, when posited as an alternative, the concept of the family farm actually tends to reinscribe the same normalcy to which it seems rhetorically opposed. And you could certainly argue this is the case with the Chipotle advertisement. Second, then, the family farm and agrarian rhetoric more broadly cannot be understood outside of the context of evolving definitions of sexual, gendered, racial, and familial normalcy. And those notions of normalcy are intimately tied into broader arrangements of power that privilege affluent, able-bodied, heterosexual white people. If alternative food activists like Raj Patel must persist in making use of the term family farm because it is rhetorically powerful and strategically useful, they need also to actively redefine what the term means, and not just by more carefully delimiting what counts as a farm, but also by broadening what counts as a family. So what exactly does this mean in practice? At a minimum, we should think a bit more critically about how promiscuous, uncritical uses of the term exclude and alienate potential allies, namely those who by choice, embodiment, or social position do not have heteronormative affluent white families with which to farm. But I mean this by this something more than a milquetoast liberal notion of inclusion in which food activists seek out underrepresented groups. That's all good and fine, but more is required. Rather, one of the most welcome elements of the alternative food movement is the way in which it posits not just alternative agricultural practices, but also alternative value systems. Namely, that our responsibilities to each other, to our communities, to our world, to our furry and feathered fellow travelers, and to the land itself must all be reflected in our actions. In much simpler terms, what's profitable is not always what's socially responsible. But the more time you spend around farmers, the more you will realize that nearly every farmer believes herself to be a family farmer, precisely because every farmer has a family, and to her that family is precious and dear. And this is true equally of the most marginal tenant farmer to the farmer who operates a 10,000-acre corn and soy operation. If you head to Kossuth County in northwest Iowa, a long drive from the nearest farmer's market where they don't grow much but corn, soy, and hogs anyhow, you may meet a farmer there who pumps atrazine onto her corn or packs hogs into a confinement lot. And if you ask her why she does those things, she is very likely to tell you about her family and what needs to be done to secure its financial future. Here, very earnestly, family and socially destructive behavior are hardly mutually exclusive, but rather are mutually reinforcing. So I've spoken at length about what history can tell us about the ethics of this thing, the family farm, but I want to turn our vision, in my final concluding point, to what it tells us about the politics of the family farm. Namely, it should now be clear that the term family farm is one way or another as much a marketing term as it is a sociologically or ecologically neutral descriptor. It is a term that alternative foods movements use to distinguish virtuous farmers from pernicious agribusinesses and healthy agriculture from environmentally corrosive agro-plunder. But just so, companies like Monsanto, as the commercial demonstrates, and conventional large-scale farm operations deploy the term to advertise to the American public a bucolic imaginary that in turn justifies agricultural subsidies, low taxes, and a favorable regulatory environment. In each case, the word family advertises more than the system of land tenure or the scale of operation. It advertises a lifestyle ostensibly conducive to embodied health and reproductive normalcy. It advertises a lifestyle, the particulars of the given farming operation aside, that produces healthy families with healthy bodies who grow healthy food that will fill the bellies of soon-to-be healthy consumers. The notion of health here moves rapidly from one of biomedical precision to a vision of health that means little beyond embodying those particular characteristics that affluent capitalist consumerism cherishes. And in both cases, it stigmatizes people who do not fit within the narrow range of human variation it recognizes as normal and acceptable. Both poles in the food debate play on the link between health, family, and virtue to divide for consumers the spectrum of agricultural operations into a Manichaean world of worthy family farms and unhealthy others. Who precisely that other is depends on the ideology of the speaker, of course. For Raj Patel, it's Monsanto. For Monsanto's customers, it is a corporate farm in the developing world with even laxer environmental regulations and more exploitative labor arrangements, or perhaps worse still, the prospect of global starvation, hunger, and food scarcity. There is no middle ground. Consumers must decide. You're either with the family farm or you're against it, though what you are with is a marketing slogan advertising health and normalcy as much as it is a functional business model. But the truth, of course, is that most farms, farmers, and agribusiness executives actually exist somewhere between saint and sinner, healthy and unhealthy. And the game of assigning agricultural sins is one that is rigged so that we will all lose. Not because it's impossible to distinguish environmentally friendly practices from those that are environmentally damaging, but because it's a game of misdirection, one designed to make us worry about how moral our consumption is, but to overlook the regulatory environment and the arrangements of capital that structure the costs of those actions. One way to think about this is that every day you are confronted with decisions about what to buy and what not to buy. You can be relatively certain that the food items you encounter will not be priced to reflect their costs to the environment or the suffering generated in their production. The price is too low. It does not adequately reflect the actual cost, environmental, human, and non-human, of its production. You are daily given the opportunity to consume without having to pay the full price of that consumption. And that is not as a result of your particular moral failing or the moral failing of farmers, numerous though both may be. It is a function of the political and economic structures that assign costs, and it is first and foremost then a structural failing. If we are in the business of accounting sins, the biggest sin for which we may have to answer is why, as a society, as communities, and as individuals, we did not try harder to change those structures. And I think that's one of the things that historical analysis really drives home and makes quite clear. My students often say, this is all good and fine, but what are we supposed to do about it? And one answer to this question is that you can simply abstain from eating the rotten fruit. And that may be part of the answer, but I don't find it to be a particularly satisfying one. A structural problem demands a structural solution. Individual purchasing habits are precisely that, the behavior of atomized, disconnected individuals. To put it slightly differently, and with only small hyperbole, when it comes to food, you are asked dozens of times per day whether or not you would like to get away with murder. Perhaps it's time we stop debating among ourselves whether or not we would like to get away with murder today, and instead start asking why the rules are written to give us that choice in the first place.
Sure, yeah, we do that while we get started, sure. All right, well, Chantal sets up. I think we can get a couple questions. Gabe, just to remind you that because of the recording, I have to repeat the question so that the question is recorded.
Just back on.
That's great. So, questions, thoughts, comments?
It's not going to help for you to repeat them unless you stand.
Yeah, I've got to get over there. One or two before we go forward. Okay, how about way over there? Yeah, in the plaid. Tell me your name and where you're from.
I'm a graduate school.
And in
Genetics.
genetics. Okay.
So my question is, what role did religion play in eugenics and sort of the invention of the family farm for this moniker?
So the question is, what role did eugenics play in the family farm and its development, in its invention? What did I say, eugenics? I meant religion, sorry.
So many of the most avowed critics of eugenics, in particular coming from religious backgrounds at the time, either evangelical Christian backgrounds. G.K. Chesterton, perhaps one of the most sort of famous critics of eugenics, is a devout Catholic. And so generally speaking, and that's not to suggest that people who were eugenicists or in favor of eugenics were necessarily anti-religious or irreligious, but it is to say that from that sort of perspective, they usually came from a slightly more secular background, or at least they were trying to bracket those religious beliefs when coming at the question of eugenics. But again, these critics of eugenics are coming highly from a religious background.
We probably should stop there, and I know there were a couple of other hands, and we'll get back to you a little bit later. Chantal.
Okay, so I want to thank the organizer for this opportunity to talk to you about food issues in a ecological context, and it's going to be a little change of pace from what we've heard already. Gabe talked about farming and reproduction, and I will talk about farming and reproduction, but in a totally different context. In fact, I will think of the family farm very loosely defined and think of it in terms of a small population as opposed to a unit. And we'll start with this. So with this slide, it's a satellite image of Earth. It's composite. First, we're looking at land cover vegetation, and you can see that there's different shade of green, and there's some brown. So the brown is desert area. You have different kind of vegetation that are present depending on where you are on the planet. Really dark green. Actually, the color, the brown is not as clear as on my screen, but you've got very dark green here for the Amazonian tropical rainforest. In the U.S., you can see there's different shade of green. And by the way, a lot of the eastern U.S. is abandoned farmland that is in secondary succession, forested area that used to be agricultural land. And in the western part, you have really arid area where you can't really grow plants. So the point of that is, depending on where you are on the planet, you can't really grow plants. You can't grow food. And depending on where you are, where you can grow food, there's species that are better suited for those areas. The composite of the cloud cover also gives you an idea of the weather, and the weather variability, and that gives you a reference to in Fitzgerald's writing where she's talking about the farmer being really worried about what the weather is going to be like and what kind of crop is going to be suitable for his or her area to grow. So I want to just put it in context that you can't farm everywhere, so having local sustainable food might be difficult in certain parts of the globe, but nevertheless, it is probably feasible. The other thing that, actually, the main thing I want to talk about in terms of is come back to some of the writing of Wendell Berry and some of the environmentalist philosophers that both Norman Wurzbach and Jed Perdue referred to. And we were talking about us, human, versus nature, and how we interact with nature. But the point I want to make is human is one species that is part of the biosphere. And as such, we have the same kind of problem that other species have in terms of population. And that brings the Fitzgerald reading where we're talking about the fittest family. Well, it really relates to Darwin's survival of the fittest. So what is the best individual for a given environment? And it assumes competition for resources, and the main resource we're competing for is food, water, and shelter. Regardless of what kind of organism you are, that's what you need. You need food. Without food, you can't live, you can't reproduce, and this is where the connection with reproduction is there's not enough food, there's not going to be any reproduction in the population. If there's no reproduction in the population, then the population is going to become extinct. Okay, I'm actually skipping a lot of things here. So here's Homo sapien, the fittest species. I mean, mind you, we are another species, but we are the dominant species on the planet right now. And it refers to evolution by natural selection. And I already said, competition for resources is the main thing that is embodied in there. And individuals that are really fit, the fittest individual is going to be able to be healthy, to reproduce a lot, pass this gene to the next generation. His offspring are also going to be better suited for the environment. They're going to be able to reproduce more, pass on, And eventually, at the population level, you're going to have evolution of the species, okay? And what I want to do here is take a little step back before we come back to 19th and 20th century and look at how the Amerindian were really, as agriculturalists, were able to increase their population, and by having high population, were actually able to go and have more warrior so they could go and fight other tribes. And they pretty much all of North America relied on the three sister crops, which was a combination of corn. So you had a mount where you would put corn in the middle, and then you had a really stocky stalk with some beans and some squash. So the beans would use the stalk of the corn as support. They would promote fertilizer because beans are nitrogen fixers. That means that they can take nitrogen from the atmosphere and incorporate that in the soil, make it available for the plant to grow. And then the squash was a ground cover that would allow kind of a biological mulching, if you will. So having the ground cover, the squash on the ground prevented some of the weeds to compete with the plants, and also prevented some evaporation directly from the soil, so you could have a better soil, and it would keep soil fertility for much longer. Mind you, that didn't prevent soil erosion on the long run, and when the soil was not really good anymore, they would migrate. They would move, the whole population would move to better land the same way farmers did. So you have migration in this, of a whole population. I'm just going to quickly show that in the western U.S., you also had Hopi Indian that did dry land agriculture. So they were able to, even though in a very dry area, be able to grow corn, mainly corn species that they selected landrace for the environment. They also had a little bit of the three sister crop going over there. By the way, here, farming was mainly done by women and children, and they would complement that with gathering of fruits and berries. And in the Hopi Indian, the men were really the agriculturalists. Okay, so we have native that are migrating to better land once the soil is depleted, and the population size really depended on how much food was available. And the Iroquois nation were actually really good about increasing their population because of that reliable food source, and then be able to go and fight the Algonquin and the Hurons, I would say. Okay, so with this in mind, I'm going to move to U.S. population, and we're back to some of the data that Gabe presented in the 1900s and early 1800s. What we're looking at here, and let me preface that this figure comes, it relates to Malthus, where in the late 1700s, realized that the population, world population, was really reaching 1 billion, was increasing exponentially, while the food crop was only increasing arithmetically. So that meant that the food supply was not keeping up with the population increase, and he hypothesized that the planet had reached its carrying capacity. There was not going to be enough food, and there was going to be famine, and the human population was going to have to stabilize at a certain number because there was not going to be enough food. So people were going to die. So this is what we're looking at, carrying capacity for the U.S. that was modeled from data from 1790 to 1910. It's a logistic growth model where you have increase in the population here dependent on the number of births in the population, number of deaths in the population, and migration. So people coming in and leaving. When you reach carrying capacity, the assumption is that the birth rate equals the death rate because there's just so many resources available for population to grow, right? So that purple curve is a model that was done with this set of data by Pearl actually did that in 1920s. And superimposed on it is the actual U.S. data, the red dots are U.S. Census data that is showing that not only are we not reaching our carrying capacity, but we're going much further. And I added the 2010 point there. So what's going on here? Why is it that carrying capacity for population in the U.S. changed? Well, if you look at when we're starting to deviate, it's about the time where you have modern agriculture. It's right after the Second World War, and that actually, Norman Wordsworth also talked a little bit about the Green Revolution and how World War I introduced a lot of new technological change. A lot of the technological change actually came after the Second World War, where the infrastructure for the war, particularly nitrogen fertilizer, chemical nitrogen fertilizer, is a direct right after the Second World War. It used to be nitrogen was used to make bombs. Now, didn't have to make bombs anymore, so what are you going to do with all that infrastructure? So they turned around and started making nitrogen fertilizer for agriculture, and that really allowed for industrial agriculture to take off. And then you can think of mechanization that also came along with more tractors from the war and more pesticide, because a lot of pesticide had been developed during the war. So all of that really enables for food production to go up. So more food, more reproduction, it's higher population possible. And the other thing is, of course, increase in healthcare. So we can have, and if you want to go more into details of technology, World War II, we can talk about it a little more. So what has happened, though, recently is we're migrating towards urban area. So this picture is actually astronaut picture, digital camera from space station. And what you're looking at is the southeast, where up to about 1950s, it was mostly a rural area, very agrarian. But in 1950s, you started having migration of population from the north and also from outside the U.S. coming in. And you can see all of those light area, really high urban concentration of people. So you have a migration away from rural area into more urban area. And so this is, in terms of farming, is going to be a problem because now the food is decoupled from where the population is, right? So can we grow enough food in those urban area for the population that is there? Question, I'm going to skip this.
12 minutes.
Yeah, okay. Just to reiterate the point, in terms of this slide is showing basically switch of population from rural to urban area. And it's increasing, and so far, like now, this year, we actually have more people living in urban area than we do living in rural area. So I'm going to leave it at that in terms of whether we're going to be able to feed locally, sustainably, a growing planet. Okay.
So keep your microphone on.
Okay.
Do we have two? Yeah, we have two different microphone people. Okay, so we have about 20 minutes, even better, for questions, and I'm sure there are lots, as this is a whole new arena that has emerged for us. I know there was, I think, a green, yeah, tell me, remind everyone to say your name and where you're from. Yeah.
I'm Daniel, I'm from the People School of Business.
Great.
And my question is for Gabe. You were talking about, and it's a concept that's actually shown up a couple of times, that the cost of food is not indicative of the true cost of food, probably more so the economic cost of food. And we've heard it a bunch of times, and I was wondering if you have any insight as to what the structural changes that you envision or that you think of to address the structural question might be.
So, sorry, no, I hate to do this, but so Daniel's question from Fuqua is something we've heard several times from different folks in the class. The cost of food is not indicative of the true cost of food, and Daniel wonders whether either Gabe or perhaps Chantal might want to answer that too, has any insight as to what the structural changes might look like to address this. Is that your, okay.
They are quite numerous. We could start, obviously, I think, with environmental regulations. Certainly, if you want to talk about something like confinement farming, much more sort of stringent regulations about where wastewater can be disposed of and what sorts of fines are incurred because of that disposal. But you can think about it much more broadly as well, which is simply to say that in the United States we have very, very weak labor protections, and we also have a very problematic immigration policy, which essentially guarantees for a lot of agriculture essentially very, very cheap supplies of labor. And so you could talk about, for example, the way in which labor law plays a major role in making sure that food is cheap. And you can think about that indirectly in terms of actual agricultural production. There's a very fine book by a gentleman by the name of Shane Hamilton called Trucking Country, which makes an argument actually about the fact that kind of overland long-haul shipping has never actually been regulated with regards to food in the United States, is largely responsible for the ability to have high commodity prices and low consumer prices. In other words, our entire system of food depends on the ability to move food from the farm to the consumer with almost no sort of thought given to the working conditions of long-haul truckers, who at this point in history handle almost all sort of food. But I don't want to make this a laundry list. I think that these are just some of the areas. And what quickly becomes evident, though, is that we can't just talk about food as a matter of taste and aesthetics, or merely what we see on sort of the consumer level. At a very fundamental level, how we treat labor, for example, and how we treat environmental externalities plays an enormous role in how food is priced. And it's because we don't protect labor, and it's because we don't think about how environmental externalities affect the future that food is so cheap.
And if I can address a little bit more in terms of environmental externalities, a lot of it has to do with air pollution, water pollution, soil degradation, desertification. And there are evaluation model of those services where you can put a price on it. And right now, big agribusiness don't pay anything, but the government pays at large. So everybody is paying for the fact that you have eutrophication, you have dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, for example, that fishing is impacted. Those are costs that are real, that are there, but that are not part of the food that you're paying, because it's subsidized in one way.
Wonderful, really interesting answers. Other comments or thoughts? Yes, name and question.
I'm Danny. I'm from Trinity Math.
You're a math major?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I guess my question is for whoever wants to answer it, but who foots the bill? Like, where does the money go if it's not being manifested in food? Who's getting shortchanged?
So who foots the bill? Where does the money go if it's not manifested in food? Who's being shortchanged?
We are. I mean, part of it, a lot of government cleanup, a lot of eutrophication, we're paying indirectly. Health care associated with that. So if we just think of air pollution, so the fact that we have bad problem with air pollution and people have asthma attack and you've got to go to the emergency room, we are, right? We're not directly paying for it, but we're indirectly paying for it. And it would be better to just have a just price right off the top and avoid all of the problem related to it, because it would be cheaper on the long run.
So just price cheaper in the long run is something that probably is going to come back again and again in some really interesting ways. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I would totally agree with that. We all are in various ways, though I would want to just sort of make the point that the way our political system handles these costs, it's one thing to tell all of you, you're paying the cost of our bad food system, but I would also encourage you to think about how poor people and those who are disenfranchised by our political system bear the disproportionate number of the costs. And of course, the people who aren't represented at all, which is future generations of the world, both inside the United States and outside of the United States, are also going to be bearing those costs. So it's one thing to sort of turn it back on all of you and say, look, you should do this out of your own self-interest, but we also need to remember that, like, as much as we may all be suffering from the problems in the American food system, if you go find like a migrant agricultural laborer, they're really suffering. Like they're being treated very, very poorly by the current system.
Other comments, thoughts, questions? Yes.
My name is Jill. I'm from the People School of Business. Right. So to kind of build on your answer to Dan's question, then it sounds like there are a lot of recommend to those of us in this room in terms of actually taking action?
That's a great question.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was so wondering what was going to happen. I just got lost. This larger question of the structural changes that both professors have recommended and also diagnosed as part of the problem, Jill wants to know what they would recommend to everybody sitting in this room to do right now. See, I wasn't spacing out. Go ahead.
The answer to this is so frustrating, and yet it's so true. And the answer is politics. And I don't mean you need to go run for office, but like, again, the way that in the United States we deal with structural problems is through our political system, be it through the executive branch, the legislative branch, or the judicial branch. Finding creative ways to put pressure on our political system to make these kinds of changes is necessary. I would also sort of encourage people not necessarily to take kind of those national boundaries as the only way of thinking about these problems. Many of the problems in terms of the costs are being borne not just in the United States, but throughout the global south, in the developing world. And that requires us to think about politics beyond national boundaries and thinking about what are sort of international institutions. So the first thing I would say is like thinking politically rather than thinking as consumers. Like thinking about people who have to be engaged with the process of rulemaking is the first and that's the first and most important step. You are a consumer. You can't erase that fact, and I'm not asking you to. I'm not saying abandon the questions about what's right to buy and what's not right to buy. But what's much more important is to think of yourself as someone who has something to say about rulemaking. Not just rulemaking in the United States, but rulemaking between the United States and other states. And so that's the kind of unsatisfying answer is you've got to do politics. And whatever that means and whatever is effective is so much more broader and sort of a much broader political debate. I think that there are certainly scholars at Duke who are thinking about these problems and new ways to conceptualize politics in ways that can effectively address the transnational nature of these problems.
Yes, so it's acting, I mean, at every level, but you can start grassroots movement are actually pretty effective on the policy side. And realize that everybody is voting, so you can actually demand things from your representative.
Yes.
Can I add to that answer as well?
As long as you identify yourself and where you're from.
I'm Tiff. I am a biology major, but not pre-med.
Okay.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Your answer was fantastic, and I do think a lot of it has to do with big political changes in the end. But I think, and this is something I'm sure all of us have talked about, but individual choice is something that's almost cliche now, but I think the importance of it shouldn't be undermined. And it's, oh man, how should I say this? We're taking this course, and we're all at this point in our lives where we're about to go out and choose a career, profession, or go to grad school or whatever. But I hope that what we learn in this course isn't just, oh, this is a course, these are the problems we're thinking about, now the problems are in our head, let's move on with the world. You know, I feel like we really do need to put these food questions at the forefront of our minds. Like even while studying for an anatomy exam, we need to question the foods that we're buying from the Duke's lobby shop or something like that. And also, as consumers, I think we have the ability to say, hey, I'm willing to pay $2 more for my eggs. I think, you know, I want to pay for some of these externalities. And there are ways to make our voices heard, I hope.
I'm so sorry I have to put that in the recording if we're going to have an accurate record. No, that's okay. Let me see if I can do it. So Tiff reminds us in her comment that even though it's almost cliche, individual choice really matters. And just as some of us, not all of us, some of us have gone on to graduate school, but some of us are at the stage we're about to go out and make a choice about who we are in the world and what we do with our lives. This kind of question about individual choice in food should be at the forefront of our mind. And the larger question of whether we are willing to pay more to honor the structural changes that have been made, say $2 for eggs, is a very important thing that should be part of every single one of us as we move into the external world. And I think that was it. Is that about right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Sorry, it wasn't very clearly thought out.
No, it's fine.
I think that's a wonderfully important point, and I don't mean to detract from that. You do have power as consumers, and you do have choices to make. And you can't erase those sort of ethical obligations and commitments. I would never ask anyone to stop doing that and stop thinking critically about what kind of choices they make as a consumer. The problem is that you need to, at least in my opinion, the way I'm looking at this, in terms to address these sort of problems, you need to define yourself not as a consumer first and foremost. Monsanto in this commercial does something very interesting. They say, we're consumers just like you, right? And this frame of consumption is, to my mind, part of the problem. One of the things that's particularly problematic about thinking about this is that when I say I pay $2 extra for my egg, is it actually that I'm paying for those externalities? Like, is it actually the case that when I pay $2, I'm actually reducing the externalities of that production? And unfortunately, the real issue here is that it's very, very difficult to know as a consumer when you're actually paying the price, right? And when you're patting someone's pocket, and when the larger issue is sort of off to the side. And so I would put it to you this way. If the question is, would you like to commit murder today, there is a right and a wrong answer to that question. There's no doubt about that. The right answer to that is, no, I don't want to commit murder today. That's the answer to the question. But don't get caught up on that question. That question, in some ways, in the moment is very, very important, but if I keep on being asked that question day in and day out, I can be relatively assured that most people in society may be answering it in ways that are not good for society. And that's the final thing that you need to think about, is that when we emphasize choice, we forget that choice is often a product of, is not often, is always a product of privilege and socioeconomic position. And so if we define our movements around choice and around consumer choice, we're defining them in ways that are very exclusive and sort of actually fence a lot of potential allies off. People who really should be a part of this and who need to have their voices heard. So in other words, it makes it, in some senses, about consumer choice rather than about food justice or economic justice. And those are things that are structural. They don't relate to how you spend your time.
Chantal, would you want to add anything?
Well, I actually want to add a positive note in the sense that when I started teaching a seminar on environmental impact of food 4 years ago, I mean, students were it was totally new and it was very different. And now, I mean, now here I am. It's like such a nice change that students are aware. I mean, the first time I taught that, and I asked students how often did they have a family meal together in a class? Nobody. I was totally shocked. And now, just the fact of having a meal and talking about food is part of our discourse. So I think it's wonderful. I mean, I think we're on to something and we're going in the right direction.
We have room for one more question over there. Name and source. Nicholas. Okay. So, remind me of your name? Margaret. Margaret wanted to know at what level of government does it make sense to address, because there are regional and national systems and impacts would differ depending on where you directed your actions. Is that about right?
I think that's an absolutely wonderful question, and it's very, very thoughtful, particularly because while we may have more political capital at a local level, the large changes are what matters. And the unfortunate reality is, with the way that the United States organizes sort of food regulation, the most important changes indeed are not only happening at the national level, but they're happening at the international level. And they really only can be addressed at either a national or an international level, at a global level in some senses. But I would say that you're absolutely right to point out that it's important to nevertheless act locally as a political creature, right? And that's to think about politics as a local problem as well, precisely for that reason, that you may be able to have more of an individual impact in that sense. But I mean, there's problems sort of like regulatory shopping, right, where a company simply is going to move to the area where the regulatory environment is most positive or something like that. That makes that only part of the solution. We do need actual national and much global sort of structural changes when it comes to food policy.
So U.S., most of the regulation are federal regulation that are enforced or directed through the states. So both working at the state and at the federal level work. And then the international question is often addressed at the federal level as well, in terms of, USDA as APHIS, which is organization trying to make sure we don't get pests in the country. So that's the international.
Okay. I think one of the things that has been really interesting that I hope gets continued on in our conversation today is about this question of the role of the consumer and understanding ourselves solely as consumer. Also, the larger role of thinking about individual choice versus political action, and how we might value in different situations those two modes of thinking about food. We also heard from genetics, from business, from math, and from biology, but not pre-med, and from Nicholas. Again, just wanting to remind ourselves of what happens in plenary when all these different perspectives ask their questions. So thanks, and see you upstairs.